They say most love stories begin in the places you'd expect: cafes, crowded events, maybe even through mutual friends. But mine? It started with cracked concrete and a woman who opened her front door like she had nothing left to prove. I wasn't looking for anything more than a job when I pulled up that morning. I had no idea the next few weeks would undo years of routine, reshape how I saw connection, and make me question why I'd spent so long just surviving instead of really living. And all of it started with one quiet glance and the kind of silence that carried more than words ever could. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The job came in like most of them do, through a short, almost impersonal message left on my voicemail. A woman named Marlene said her driveway had cracked down the center after last winter's frost, and with the rains due to roll in soon, she needed someone who could handle both the tear-out and repair before it turned into a swamp. Her voice was calm, measured, a little tired, and though she didn't say much beyond the details, there was something in her tone that stuck with me. Not desperation, not urgency, but the kind of weariness that settles in after years of fixing things. Yourself? I returned the call, we set a date, and 2 days later, I found myself pulling up to a modest but well-kept home on the edge of town. The house sat just outside the city limits, a little removed from its neighbors, wrapped in quiet. It was the kind of place you could blink and miss if you weren't looking at pale blue ranch with aging shutters, a red mailbox with peeling paint, and a front yard split cleanly by the offending driveway. It had clearly been a nice slab once, wide and smooth, but now it wore a jagged fracture down its center like a scar. Nature had started reclaiming it, 2 small weeds sprouting in the crevices. Dirt pressed into the edges like time itself had been trying to erase the man-made straight lines. She opened the door before I even got out of the truck. I remember noticing her posture, first upright, alert, like someone trained long ago to carry themselves with presence even when they didn't feel it. She looked to be in her early 50s, tall and slim, with silver streaks woven through shoulder-length black hair. No makeup, no pretense. She wore jeans and a loose flannel shirt with the sleeves pushed up, like she'd already been working around the house that morning. Her eyes were sharp, not unkind, but guarded. She gave me a small nod, not a smile, just enough of a gesture to let me know she saw me, expected me, and was already doing the mental math of how long the job would take and how much it would cost. I introduced myself and stepped onto the cracked concrete, walking its length slowly, crouching to inspect the worst of the damage. She followed at a distance, silent at first, and when she finally spoke, it was to point out the part she was most worried about: the corner that flooded in heavy rain. The seam near the garage that was starting to dip. She knew her property. She didn't try to pretend she didn't, but the way she spoke, precise. Clip told me she'd probably dealt with too many people who had either ignored her concerns or overcharged her for solving them. I nodded as she explained and took quiet notes. I didn't try to charm her, didn't offer any grand solutions. I just listened. I gave her an estimate before I left that day and told her I could start by Monday if the weather held. Again, signed the paperwork without hesitation and handed me a folded check with the deposit already filled out. As I walked back to my truck, I glanced over my shoulder once. She was still standing there on the porch, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the broken concrete, not like she was evaluating the damage, but like she was waiting to see what I'd do next. Not just with the job, but maybe unknowingly with both. Of our lives, Monday came with heavy clouds stretched across the sky, the kind that promised rain but didn't yet deliver it. I arrived early, earlier than I needed to, partly out of habit and partly out of something I hadn't yet named. Her truck was already parked at the side of the house, and from the way her porch light was on, I figured she'd been awake for a while. Still, she didn't come out when I parked. I didn't take it personally. Some clients just want the work done without conversation. But something about Marlene didn't strike me as indifferent, just ... practiced, like someone who used silence as a shield, not a wall. I set up my tools and mapped out the first section of the concrete I needed to cut. As I measured the width and depth of the cracks, I noticed how the weeds had pushed up from underneath, little blades of green defying cement and time. It reminded me of resilience, and that thought strangely made me think of her. The kind of woman who gave off softness at first glance, but there was something in the way she looked at her property. Her home, like every board and window, had been held together by her will alone. It didn't take long to realize she wasn't just a homeowner. She was a caretaker of things most people overlooked. By the time I had the saw ready to begin scoring the concrete, she stepped outside with a cup of coffee in one hand and a small ceramic bowl of something in the other. Her shirt had changed now, a black hoodie with faded lettering across the front, but her expression was the same, neutral, watchful. She didn't walk toward me, just stood at the edge of the porch sipping her coffee like a ritual. Gave her a polite nod and started the saw. The blade screaming to life and slicing through the slab with a sound that tore through the still morning. It was loud, harsh, unapologetic like the work itself. And still, she didn't flinch. She just sipped her coffee and watched. The first few hours passed with rhythm and sweat. The sky stayed heavy, but the rain held off. I cut away the damaged sections, cleared out debris, and began preparing the rebar. At some point, I looked up to see her crouch down at the edge of the driveway, pulling weeds with a small hand spade. It surprised me. Most clients left me alone entirely, disappearing. Inside with the comfort of central heating and silence, but she stayed. She worked. Not near me exactly, but not far either. It was like we were sharing space, quietly, without needing to define it. And though neither of us spoke, the silence between us didn't feel empty. When I stopped for lunch, I noticed she had left a second bowl on the porch next to a thermos. It was still warm, its chicken and rice seasoned simply, but made with care. I didn't ask if it was for me. I just sat on the edge of the porch, nodded in her direction, and ate. She didn't join me. She had gone inside by then, likely tending to things that required the same quiet attention she'd given the weeds. I don't know why it mattered. But that small act, her setting out food for me without announcing it, settled something inside me. I didn't realize had been restless. Each day that week followed a similar pattern. I'd arrive early, start the work, and she'd emerge mid-morning like clockwork. Sometimes with coffee, sometimes with nothing. She always acknowledged me, but never with more than a few words. And yet her presence became a kind of rhythm. I noticed how she swept her porch in tight circles, how she checked the mail and sorted through it on the bench outside, how she watered her plants with a methodical care that reminded me of someone tending to something fragile. It wasn't about the tasks. It was about the attention, the presence, the way she did things slowly, as if rushing might break something important. On the third day, was bent over the fresh pour, smoothing the surface with slow, practiced strokes, when I caught her reflection in the window beside me. She was watching me, not the work, but me, and when our eyes met through the glass, she didn't look away. She didn't smile, but something about her gaze softened, just slightly, before she disappeared from view. I didn't know what to make of it. I've had women flirt. I've had clients who liked to chat, some who overshared, others who kept things strictly transactional. But Marlene was none of those things. She wasn't trying to be noticed. She was trying to see, and that was something different entirely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Later that afternoon, as I packed up for the day, she finally spoke more than a few words. She stood on the porch with her arms crossed, eyes on the freshly set concrete, and said it looked better than she expected. Her voice carried a kind of reluctant surprise, like she'd grown used to being underwhelmed. I told her it would cure overnight, and that the next phase would be the expansion cuts, then the seal. She nodded, and then, after a long pause, asked if I always worked alone. The question hung there, casual in delivery, but pointed. I told her yes most of the time. She didn't ask why. She just nodded again and turned back toward the door, her hand lingering on the frame for a second too long. I drove home that night with the windows down, the scent of cement dust clinging to my skin, and her voice echoing in my ears. "Do you always work alone?" It wasn't just a question about labor. It was something else, something closer to how we exist, how we move through our days, how we fill the hours between waking and sleep. And I realized I did work alone. I lived alone. I moved through life like a man passing through someone else's story, never really touching anything. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep doing that. By the end of the week, the driveway had taken shape. Smooth, new, functional. It would hold. It would last. But there was something else forming just beyond the edges of that. Concrete, something not measured in inches or pounds or drying time. Something quieter. Something human. And while I couldn't quite name it yet, I knew it was real. Because for the first time in years, I started to look forward to morning not for the job, but for her presence in it. The final pour had cured. Overnight, smooth and even like glass under the morning light. When I pulled into her driveway that Friday, it felt different. Not just because the work was nearly done, but because the silence between us had started to shift in texture. It was no longer the kind that keeps people separated. It turned into something shared, something lived in, familiar, but not yet spoken aloud. The kind of silence that grows between people who are paying attention to each other in a way most don't. I unpacked the saw for the expansion cuts. She stepped out onto the porch, holding 2 mugs, steam curling in the morning chill. I took one without a word, and we stood there for a while, shoulder to shoulder, but with a few feet between us. Drinking in the morning with the kind of slowness that doesn't need to be earned. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hover. But she didn't go back inside either. Instead, she sat on the top step of the porch and watched me work, not like she was supervising, but like she didn't want the Joe Bohr meet to end just yet, as the blade cut through the concrete. Thin lines forming to allow the slab room to breathe through the seasons. I found myself thinking about that. Breathing, movement, how structures, like people, need space to expand or they crack. She struck me as someone who had spent years holding herself tight, keeping everything neatly within the lines, never giving herself permission to shift too far in any direction. But lately, I'd seen it. The way she exhaled slower when I arrived, the way her posture softened when I spoke. She was making space, and whether she realized it or not, I was doing the same. That afternoon, when the expansion cuts were finished and the tools cleaned, I let her know the work was done. I expected the usual another quiet nod, a quick thank you, maybe a check handed over with practiced efficiency. Instead, she paused, her brow furrowed like she was trying to decide something. She asked if I could come back the next day, not to work, but to help her move a few heavy bags of gravel she'd been meaning to spread along the side of the house. It was the kind of task most people would call a landscaper for, but she didn't want a landscaper. She wanted me. The way she asked wasn't casual, and it wasn't flirtatious. It was vulnerable, like she was giving herself permission to ask for something small and human. I said yes without hesitation. The next day, I returned in plain clothes, no work boots, no truck bed full of tools, just a shovel, gloves, and a quiet sense of anticipation. She greeted me with that same neutral expression she always wore, but this time her hair was down, and she was wearing a soft cream sweater that made her seem a little more at ease, like she'd peeled back one more layer. We didn't talk much as we worked, just a few directions, a couple of shared glances when we nearly bumped into each other. But something about the way she handed me the bags, the way she moved beside me in rhythm, felt like a slow dance performed. In work clothes and dust, after we finished, she offered me a drink. Not water this time, but something stronger whiskey poured neat. Into 2 small glasses she pulled from the kitchen cabinet like they'd been waiting for an occasion. We sat on the porch again, this time in the fading afternoon light. The last of the autumn sun, stretching our shadows across the newly finished driveway. She leaned back, sipped her drink slowly, and said it looked better than she'd imagined. I could tell she wasn't just talking about the concrete. The conversation started slow, just surface-level things at first. Long I'd been doing this kind of work, why I never hired a crew. She asked if I always stayed in one place, or if I moved around. I told her I used to travel more when I was younger, that for a long time I thought movement meant freedom. She nodded like she understood. Then she said something that caught me off guard. She said stillness can be its own kind of prison if you're not careful. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to. Her voice held years in it. She told me she used to be married, briefly, that it ended before it ever really began. Left. One day, and never came back, not in some dramatic storm out. But gradually, the way people disappear when they've stopped choosing you in the small daily ways. She said after that, she stopped letting people in, not out of bitterness, but because it became easier to survive on her own. Simpler, predictable. No one could disappoint her if she didn't expect anything. But now, watching me work over the last week, she realized something had started to stir that she hadn't felt in a long time, something quiet but persistent. She didn't say the word hope, but it hovered in the air between us like a held breath. As the sun dipped below the trees and the porch light flickered on, we sat there in silence again. But it wasn't awkward. It was heavy in the best way. Waited with everything unsaid, but understood. Looked over at her, at the way the light caught in her hair, at the curve of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't closed off either, and I felt something settle in me. Not excitement, not desire, something deeper. Recognition, maybe, or belonging. I left just after dark, the taste of whiskey still lingering on my tongue and her voice echoing in the quiet space of my truck. She hadn't asked me to stay, and I hadn't offered, but there was a mutual understanding that we weren't finished yet. Not with whatever this was becoming. The job had ended. The concrete was poured, smooth and clean. But something else had begun to take shape beneath it all. Something more fragile and alive than any foundation I'd ever laid. And as I drove home, I found myself hoping it would. Rain the next day just enough to test the edges, to see what held. Not the driveway, but us. The rain did come just as I'd hoped, but not in the angry sideways sheets that tear through gutters and flood fields. It was gentler than that, steady and soft. The kind of rain that lingers on leaves and wraps the morning in a quiet hush. I woke up to the sound of it tapping on my window, a rhythm that felt almost meditative, and before I even made it to the kitchen for coffee, my mind had already drifted to her. Marlene. I didn't have any reason to visit her that day. My work was done, and our agreement was complete. But something in me stirred at the thought of her house, her porch, the steam rising off the mugs she always held like armor. I didn't want to intrude, but I didn't want to stay away either. By mid-morning, I found myself driving in her direction. No real excuse in hand, just an instinct pulling me forward. I told myself I'd do a courtesy check on the concrete, make sure the water was draining properly, that the expansion cuts hadn't shifted with the pressure. But deep down, I knew. That wasn't the reason. I could have texted, could have called. But I didn't. I just showed up. Windshield wipers slicing across my view like a metronome. Counting down the seconds between intention and action. When I pulled up, the driveway was glistening. Surface held firm. Water beating and rolling. Off the slope exactly as it should. The work had done its job. But what caught my attention wasn't the flawless finish, it was her. She was sitting on the porch, legs tucked underneath her, wrapped in a light blanket, staring out into the rain with a stillness that felt heavy. I stepped out of my truck slowly, not wanting to startle her. She didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, she just nodded once like she had expected me all along. I didn't ask to come up. I didn't need to. She slid over on the bench, making space beside her without a word. I sat down, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off her, but still with that respectful distance we'd maintained since day one. The rain continued to fall, gentle and persistent, creating a curtain of sound around us that made the rest of the world feel far away. She handed me a muggle, ready warm in her hands, and for the first few minutes, we just sat there sipping in silence. No explanations. No pleasantries. Just the quiet company of two people who had somehow found a way to share space without asking for it. Eventually, she spoke. Not about the rain or the driveway, or even the oddity of my unannounced visit. Instead, she told me about a dream she'd had the night before. In it, she was young again, walking barefoot through a field she didn't recognize. chasing the sound of music that kept drifting further away every time she got close. She said it wasn't sad exactly, but it left her waking with a feeling she hadn't been able to shake, a kind of yearning. Maybe, or a reminder of something she'd forgotten she missed. I listened, not just with my ears, but with my whole attention. It wasn't the dream that mattered, it was what it meant to her. The way she described it, I could tell it had stirred something loose inside her, something buried under years of practicality and self-reliance. I didn't try to interpret it or offer advice. I just let her speak. And when she finished, she turned to me with a look that felt more vulnerable than anything she'd shared so far. She said she didn't usually tell people her dreams, that she'd learned long ago how to keep things close. Because once you let someone in, you gave them the power to disappear with a part of you. I told her I wasn't going anywhere. The words came out before I even thought them through. And once they were out there, hanging between us like the mist in the air, I realized how true they were. I didn't want to be just another passerby. In her carefully contained life, I didn't want to be the man who fixed something and left. I wanted to stay, to keep showing up, not because she needed me, but because I wanted to be where she was. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stood, walked to the edge of the porch, and stared out into the driveway like it held answers. Watched her from behind the way. Her shoulders lifted slightly with each breath, the way the rain dampened the edges of her blanket. She stayed there for a long time, long enough that I started to wonder if I'd said too much. But then she turned around, and her face, normally composed and cautious, was different, softer, braver. She walked back to the bench, sat beside me again, and reached for my hand without a word. Her fingers were cold from the rain, but her grip was steady. It wasn't romantic, not in the cinematic sense. It was something more intimate. A quiet agreement, an unspoken acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, neither of us wanted to keep going through life alone. I didn't squeeze her hand back immediately. I just let it rest in mine, feeling the shape of her knuckles, the ridges of time and work, etched into her skin. It was the first time she had touched me, and it felt like the most honest moment we'd shared. The rain continued, steady and forgiving, as if giving us time to figure out what came next. I didn't press for more. I didn't speak again. I just stayed with her on that porch, letting the moment stretch out between us like fresh concrete, wet unset, full of possibility. And though I didn't know where this would go or how it would unfold, I knew that something had shifted. Not just in her, not just in me, but in the space between us. As I sat there, watching the way the raindrops clung to the edge of the roof before falling in slow, measured arcs, I realized something. Connection doesn't always announce itself with fireworks or grand declarations. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a shared cup of coffee, in the stillness of a rainy morning, in the touch of a hand that says, without words, I see you, I trust you, I want you here. And I knew, then and there, that I wasn't just fixing a driveway, I was building something else, something real, something worth staying for. The rain eventually let up, leaving the air cool and fragrant, thick with the scent of wet earth and pine. And that kind of stillness that follows a long drizzle always did something to MIT. Felt like the world had taken a breath and was holding it.
House.
Been up with all ever and ever about fat over an accurate And that morning, as I sat beside Marlene on her porch with her hand still resting in mine, it was impossible to ignore the shift between us. There was a quiet understanding blooming delicate, but undeniable. Something had changed. Neither of us said it aloud, but our silence no longer meant distance. It meant comfort. We sat there long after our coffee had gone cold. The driveway in front of us, now fully cured and glistening under the low morning sun, was a symbol of completion. But what I felt sitting beside her didn't resemble an ending. It felt like the very first stirrings of something beginning. In that moment, I realized how strange and beautiful it was that a woman I barely knew 2 weeks ago had started to occupy more of my thoughts than anyone had in years, maybe ever. She eventually let go of my hand, not abruptly, but gently, as if untying a ribbon rather than breaking a grip. She stood and told me she had errands to run in town and asked if I'd be around later that week to help with some gravel work out back. I nodded, offered to bring lunch this time. She gave me a half-smile that lingered longer than any expression she'd worn before. It didn't feel like a goodbye, more like a promise of return. I left her property slowly, taking one last glance in the rearview mirror at the house, with its weathered shutters, and the woman who lived inside it, who was gradually becoming more than just a client. The rest of my day passed in a blur of errands and background noise. I tried to focus on other tasks, but my mind wandered constantly. I found myself rewinding our conversations, dissecting the way she looked at me, the careful pauses between her words, the moments when her defenses slipped and I caught glimpses of something tender and raw beneath them. That night, I didn't sleep well. It wasn't anxiety. It wasn't excitement either. It was something more complex, kind of emotional restlessness I hadn't felt in years. A stirring in my chest I couldn't quite name, as if my heart had started beating in. A new rhythm in my body hadn't caught up yet. I laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, tracing the grain of the wood above me with my eyes, and realized how long it had been since I'd truly let someone in, since I'd allowed myself to care about where something might go. The next 2 days passed without hearing from her. I didn't want to be overbearing, so I gave her space, trusting she'd reach out when she was ready. But I won't lie, each time my phone buzzed, I hoped it was her. Each time it wasn't. Something inside me dimmed just a little. It was strange, this vulnerability. I was used to working alone, living alone, moving through my days with quiet purpose. But now, my routine felt hollow, like I was going through the motions while waiting for something or someone to arrive. On the third morning, just as I was about to start a new job on the other side of town, I got a text from her. It was short, just a sentence and a time. "If you're still up for it, I could use your help this afternoon. 2 p.m. No emojis. No extra words. Classic Marlene. But my chest loosened immediately. I texted back a simple, of course. "I'll bring lunch." And just like that, the weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying slipped off my shoulders. I arrived just before 2 with 2 paper bags filled with deli sandwiches and bottled tea. She greeted me at the door in a soft blue sweater, her hair pulled up but with a few strands loose around her face. She looked different, not dressed up, not made up but lighter somehow, like she'd let something go since I last saw her. She invited me in this time, a first, and I stepped over the threshold with a mixture of familiarity and curiosity. Her home was warm and clean, decorated with intention photos on the walls, worn books on shelves, little objects that clearly held sentimental value. It was lived in the best way. We sat at her small kitchen table, eating sandwiches in a comfortable silence that no longer felt like a wall. She asked about my week, and I asked about hers, and somewhere in the middle of her telling me about a stubborn leak under her sink, she laughed a real, full laugh, and I felt something inside me settle. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no orchestral swell, just a laugh. But it was real, and it was hers, and I had never wanted to hear anything more. After lunch, we got to work spreading gravel along the side of the house. The ground was uneven, and the bags were heavier than expected, but we fell into an easy rhythm. I'd shovel, she'd rake. Occasionally our hands would brush, and each time it happened, we'd pause just slightly longer than needed. She started to ask questions about my family, about where I grew up, about whether I'd ever thought of settling down somewhere for good. I answered honestly. Told her I'd never found the right place or the right reason to stay put. She didn't press, but I could feel her wheels turning. When we finished, we stood side by side, admiring the neatly leveled gravel bed. The late afternoon sun had returned, warm and golden, casting long shadows across the yard. I turned to say something, I'm not even sure what, but before I could, she looked at me with a gaze so open, so raw, that it stopped me in my tracks. She reached out and touched my arm, just briefly, and said, "You're the only man in my 50 years to make me feel this way." The words hung in the air like a breath caught in the middle of a sentence. My heart thudded once, then twice, and the world around us seemed too quiet. Even though I'm sure birds were still chirping and leaves were still rustling in the trees, she didn't take the words back. She didn't clarify. She just looked at me, steady and unflinching, like she'd just revealed the most vulnerable truth she had. And I stood there, holding her gaze, feeling something break open in me, a dam. Maybe, or a door I hadn't touched in years. Because the truth was, she wasn't the only one feeling something. I had to. And the feeling wasn't small. It was the kind of feeling that doesn't come around often, that demands to be acknowledged, that dares you to act. I didn't answer her right away. How could I? There are moments in life where words feel like a foreign language, where the gravity of what someone says hits deeper than language is built to carry. Her voice, steady and raw, still echoed in my chest long after it left her lips. The only man in my 50 years to make me feel this way wasn't flirtation. It wasn't a compliment tossed carelessly into the breeze. It was a confession, a piece of her life placed carefully into my hands. And in that moment, all I could do was stand still and feel it. The wind had picked up slightly. Tugging at her loose hair and pulling the scent of the earth and gravel through the air, I realized I was holding my breath, not because I was nervous, but because part of me didn't want to break whatever spell had just formed between us. She didn't look away, didn't retreat into her usual composed silence. She just waited, a quiet courage in her eyes, giving me the space to respond however I chose. That alone told me more about her than any story she could have told. I finally spoke, my voice low and a little unsteady, not from fear, but from honesty. I told her I hadn't expected this, not when I took the job, not when I saw the cracks in her driveway or the guarded look in her eyes. I told her I came here to fix something outside, but I didn't expect to be stirred inside. And somehow, being with her, sitting beside her on the porch, talking over sandwiches, working shoulder to shoulder, it all made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in a very long time. I told her the truth, that she wasn't alone in what she felt. And then I watched her take a breath, slow and deep, like she was finally allowing herself to exhale after years of holding it all in. We didn't talk much after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because something had already been spoken that didn't need repetition. We carried the tools back to her garage side by side. She walked me to my truck as the sky dimmed and the day folded into early evening. I opened the door, placed my hand on the frame, and hesitated. I wanted to stay longer, but I also knew that sometimes giving something room to breathe was better than rushing it. Before I left, she reached out and touched my chest lightly with her fingertips, just over my heart, possessively. Not demandingly, just gently, like she was making sure it was still beating after everything we just shared. I gave her a small nod, then got in and started the engine. I backed out of the driveway. She stayed there in the same spot, arms folded but relaxed, watching me go, not like someone expecting loss, but like someone believing now that maybe return was possible. Now, I spent that night wrapped in a different kind of silence than I was used to. Not lonely, not restless, just reflective. The kind of silence that comes when something important has shifted. I thought about how rare it was to meet someone later in life who could disarm you not with charm, but with presence, with quiet, strength, with the courage to say what they felt, even after years of self-protection. I'd been around enough people to know when someone was putting on a show. Marlene never had. What she gave was real. The following morning I received a text from her just after 9. It simply read, "I'm going to the farmer's market later. Would you want to come?" It was so casual, so unassuming, and yet I knew how much that invitation carried. This was someone who'd spent most of her years choosing solitude. This was someone who had learned to build her life with quiet independence, who didn't make space for people as easily. And here she was, offering me a seat beside her. I replied yes. What time? We met at 11 in the gravel parking lot, behind the market stalls. She wore a long coat and a scarf that danced in the breeze. She looked comfortable in her skin that morning, like a woman who had finally stopped bracing for something to go wrong. We walked slowly, weaving between stalls of late autumn produce, hand-poured candles, jars of honey, and hand-knitted scarves. She paused at a table of dahlias, fingers brushing the petals with such gentleness it made me pause. Anything right away, she just took it all in, her pace deliberate, her attention full. We talked more than usual, but it wasn't forced. It was easy, like a rhythm we'd fallen into without realizing it. She told me about her mother's love for dahlias, how they used to plant them together every spring. She spoke about the first time she came to this market after her divorce, and how strange it felt to move through spaces built for couples as a woman alone. And I listened not just to her words, but to the space between them, the history she was trusting me to hold. At one stall, a woman selling handcrafted soaps asked if we were married. The question was casual, meant more as a marketing tactic than a true inquiry. I expected Marlene to correct her, to deflect with her usual poise. But instead, she just smiled politely and said, "Not yet." I turned to look at her, stunned. Not by the joke, but by the calm confidence in her tone. She didn't blush. She didn't retreat. Though her eyes sparkled with mischief, there was something honest behind her words. We didn't talk about it afterward. We didn't need to. After the market, she invited me back to her house for lunch. She made a simple salad and served warm bread with olive oil. We ate on the porch again, the afternoon sun slicing through the trees, warming the old wooden planks. Beneath our feet, there was something sacred about the simplicity of it. No music, no distractions. Just the crunch of bread, the occasional rustle of wind, and the gentle rhythm of shared presence as we finished. She leaned back and said softly, "I never imagined I'd feel like this again. Not at this age. Not after everything." I didn't press her to explain. I just reached across the table and took her hand again. This time I didn't let go. The next few days settled into a quiet rhythm I hadn't realized I was craving until it wrapped itself around my routine. Marlene and I didn't fall into a whirlwind romance or start spending every waking hour together. No, it was something gentler, something steady, like the way the sun begins to rise a little later in the fall. Gradual, but noticeable. She'd text me in the mornings. Sometimes just a photo of her coffee mug on the porch, or a shot of the fog clinging to the trees behind her house. I'd reply with something simpler, picture of the driveway glistening in dew, or the way her gravel path was holding up beautifully in the soft rain. They weren't romantic messages, not in the traditional sense, but they were our way of saying, "I'm thinking of you. You still matter, even when we're not standing beside each other." One afternoon, about a week after the farmer's market, I stopped by with no real reason other than wanting to see her face again. I told myself I'd check in on the edging near the drive, make sure the settling gravel wasn't drifting into the grass. I knew better. When I parked and walked up the driveway, I saw her through the window. She was standing in the kitchen, washing dishes with her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck.
Ow.
The light framed her in a way that stopped me for a second. There was something about seeing her in that domestic stillness that felt deeply intimate-like. I was witnessing a part of her life she rarely allowed anyone to see. She smiled when she saw me, not with surprise, but with something closer to welcome. I helped her finish drying the last of the dishes, and when I reached for a towel, our hands brushed. Neither of us pulled away. That was the thing about Marlene. She was never in a hurry. Everything she did, every gesture or glance, had intention behind it. She lived slowly, but not lazily. She just knew the value of stillness, and somehow being around her made me want to slow down too. It's not just with her, but with everything we spent that afternoon working together on her back garden. Flower beds were overgrown in places, and the stone borders needed reinforcing. We dug, we trimmed, we moved stones, and laughed over which plants looked salvageable and which were just stubborn weeds masquerading as something more elegant. It wasn't glamorous work, but there was joy in it. The kind of shared task that says more about a relationship than candlelight or polished conversation ever could. We got our hands dirty. We worked in sync. And when we stood back to admire what we'd done, there was a sense of pride in both our faces that went deeper than flowers or freshly turned soil. She invited me to stay for dinner. She cooked for real, no sandwiches, no takeout. She made roasted vegetables and a creamy risotto that she claimed was a little too salty, though I didn't notice. We ate at the same little table in her kitchen, the window cracked open to let the scent of rain-dampened leaves drift in. At one point, she put on a record, something soft and jazzy, and we let the music fill the spaces where conversation paused. She didn't talk about love or her past or even the moment on the gravel path when she told me how I made her feel. Instead, she asked about my childhood, what kind of boy I had been, if I'd liked school, what my mother was like. It felt like she was trying to see who I really was beneath the years and the tools. In the quiet way I moved through the world, and I let her. I told her about growing up in a small house with peeling paint and a mother who worked 2 jobs. I told her about the summer I first held a hammer and how the sound of wood splitting open under the nail made me feel powerful and calm at the same time. I told her about the mistakes I made in my 20s, the people I lost touch with, and the quiet vow I'd made sometime in my 30s to never settle for anything that didn't feel like peace. She didn't interrupt. She just listened, really listened, in the way so few people do anymore. After dinner, we stepped onto the porch again, our now familiar place, and sat with steaming cups of tea. The air had turned crisp, and I could smell the faintest hint of someone's fireplace burning nearby. She pulled a blanket around her shoulders, and I, without a word, moved closer and wrapped part of it around me too. We sat like that for a long time, our bodies not touching fully, but connected in that shared warmth. Eventually, she spoke. It's not loud, not dramatically. Just a quiet sentence that dropped like a stone into a still pond. I've never felt this safe with someone I barely know. I turned toward her, but she wasn't looking at me. She was staring out into the trees, her eyes glossy, but not from sadness. From something more complicated. Hope, maybe. Or wonder. I wanted to say something equally profound, but all I could manage was, "You know me better than most ever have." And it was true. Somehow, in the midst of garden beds and gravel paths and risotto and porch tea, she had gotten under my skin. Not in a dramatic head-spinning way, but in a grounded, honest way. The kind of knowing that doesn't demand attention, but earns it slowly over time. And I was starting to see that everything about her had a quiet strength, cautious smiles. The way she opened her life, one small gesture at a time, was exactly the kind of love I'd stopped believing existed. We didn't kiss that night. We didn't even touch again. But when I left, her hand lingered on my arm a beat longer than usual, and her voice, soft and steady, said, "Come by tomorrow if you can. I'd like you to meet someone." I raised a brow, curious but didn't ask. I just nodded and stepped into the night air, my chest warm with something I dared to call contentment. Not excitement, not infatuation, but the deep, slow-building sense that something real was growing in. I was ready for it. The next morning arrived with a thin veil of fog blanketing the yard outside my window. It clung to the tops of trees and softened the light that filtered through my curtains, giving everything a hushed, almost sacred feeling. I took my time getting ready, not out of laziness, but because something inside me knew today would hold weight. When Marlene said she wanted me to meet someone, she hadn't clarified who, but the way she said it, the careful way her eyes held mine just a second longer than usual, made me feel it wasn't a passing thought. It mattered. And if it mattered to her, it mattered to me. By the time I pulled into her driveway, the fog had lifted, revealing her home exactly as it always was, modest. Lived in and surrounded by trees that swayed gently in the morning breeze. She met me at the door, dressed in jeans and a light sweater, her hair loosely gathered at the back again. There was a warmth in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Not excitement, not nerves exactly, but a kind of quiet readiness, like she was about to offer me a new corner of herself, and was hoping I'd accept it without flinching. She didn't say much as she led me through the house and out the back door. The sun was climbing higher now, casting long streaks of gold across the dew-covered grass. We walked a narrow path I hadn't noticed before, lined with worn stepping stones that looked like they'd been placed years ago and slowly forgotten. At the end of the path was a small wooden structure, part greenhouse, part shed tucked beneath the reach of two towering oaks. As we got closer, I saw the door was slightly ajar. Inside, it smelled of soil and lavender, the earthy scent mixing with something faintly sweet, honeysuckle maybe, or aged wood. There were shelves lined with clay pots, some filled with green shoots, others cracked and empty. A small wooden bench sat beneath a window streaked with condensation. Beside it stood a woman with silver hair pulled into a long braid that reached the middle of her back. She turned as we stepped in, and for a moment her eyes locked on mine with an expression that was part curiosity, part appraisal. "Miles," Marlene said, her voice softer than usual. "This is my Aunt June." I didn't know what I was expecting. A friend, a neighbor, maybe even a sibling. But not this. Not a woman who carried the same quiet strength Marlene did. Only older, weathered, and sharpened by time. June didn't smile immediately. Instead, she studied me. Eyes flicking from my boots to my hands, to the way I stood just beside her, niece not touching, but undeniably drawn to her. "Nice to meet you," I said, extending my hand. She took it, her grip firm but not aggressive, and finally offered a small nod of approval. "You're the one who fixed the driveway." I nodded, in the gravel path. "And a few flower beds. And now?" she asked, a brow raised. I glanced at Marlene, who was watching the exchange. With that small, knowing smile of hers, "Now I suppose I'm just staying around." June considered that for a moment, then turned and walked toward the back of the shed, where she motioned for us to sit. There were 3 old wooden chairs arranged in a triangle. We sat, and the air settled between us. The conversation started slow. June asked questions, polite at first, then more pointed. She wanted to know where I was from, what my intentions were, if I believed people could change. She wasn't unkind, but she didn't waste time either. There was a protectiveness in her tone, one born of experience, not suspicion. And I understood. Marlene had let me into her life, and now I was being measured not for perfection, but for sincerity. I answered her questions honestly, even the hard ones. When she asked what I'd been running from in my years of moving from place to place, I told her the truth, that sometimes I didn't know, and other times I feared settling meant stopping. That I'd spent so long being self-sufficient, I'd forgotten how to make space for someone else. And now somehow I was trying. At one point, June leaned back in her chair, looked at Marlene and said, "You've always chosen solitude, but it seems this time solitude didn't choose you back." Marlene didn't respond, but her eyes shimmered slightly in the morning light. She reached out and rested her hand on mine, her fingers curling around mine in a way that felt natural now, like we'd been doing it forever. After a while, June stood and excused herself, giving us a smile that held something close to approval. As she disappeared down the path, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. "She means well," Marlene said. "I know," I replied. "She's like a lighthouse, bright enough to guide you, but sharp enough to warn you off the rocks." Marlene laughed, the sound full and unguarded. "She raised me after my parents died. She doesn't let anyone close unless she sees they've got steady feet. I've spent my life learning to walk steady," I said quietly. She looked at me then, eyes searching, and I could see the weight of her memories behind them. Years of silence, years of doing it all alone, and now something new, something neither of us expected. I squeezed her hand gently, and she didn't let go. We stayed in the shed for another hour, talking about nothing and everything. She told me about how June taught her to grow herbs, how that little shed had been her refuge for most of her life, a place where the world couldn't touch her. And now here I was, sitting inside it, not intruding, not rescuing, just being. There, when I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the front door, like always. But this time, as I reached for the handle, she stopped me. "I don't let people into that shed," she said softly. "That place is mine." I nodded, understanding more than she knew. "But I wanted you to see it. That was it." No grand confession, no over-the-top declaration, just that simple truth. And in it, everything I needed to know. I wasn't just fixing things in her yard anymore. I was being invited into the places she'd once locked shut, the spaces she'd only ever occupied alone. And somehow, that felt like the beginning of everything. The day after visiting the shed with Marlene and meeting her Aunt June, something inside me felt heavier, but not in a burdensome way. Was more like stepping into boots that finally fit, or shrugging on a coat that had hung in someone else's closet for far too long and finding that it now felt like it belonged to me. I wasn't sure what it meant in the larger scheme of things, whether Marlene and I were heading toward something official, something with a label, something meant to last. But I knew we were past the point of casual visits and polite small talk. We had crossed an invisible line, one neither of us had marked but both instinctively recognized, and now we were in unfamiliar territory. That morning, as I sipped my coffee and looked out the window of my small rental, I realized I was no longer just passing through. I had started to anchor. My thoughts didn't drift toward the next job or the next city or the next person who might need my hands. They circled her laugh, her stillness, her porch, her gravel path. Her life. I didn't have any scheduled work that day, so I cleaned up my place a little, did a grocery run, and found myself wandering through the local hardware store without purpose. I kept thinking about the shed, the old rusted hinges on the door, the cracked stone path leading up to it, the loose shelves. My brain defaulted to problem solving, but this time it wasn't about the structure itself. It was about what it meant. That shed wasn't just a space in her backyard. It was history. It was grief and growth. It was safety. And she had let me in. She had shared it with me. Not out of obligation, but out of choice. That meant something. That meant a lot. By late afternoon, I found myself driving back toward her place, not entirely sure what I'd say or if I'd even knock. Sometimes I did this, just drove, followed the curve of the road, the way it snaked through the woods like it was leading me somewhere important. I parked just past the driveway and walked the last few steps, more to clear my head than anything else. Her house looked the same as always, but something felt different. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was the weight of the previous day still resting on my shoulders. Or maybe it was what I saw when I looked toward the porch, Marlene standing there, arms crossed, a look on her face I hadn't seen before. It wasn't closed off exactly, but it wasn't open either. It was guarded, like something had shifted. I walked up slowly, gave a small wave, and she returned it with a tight nod. We stood in silence for a moment before I asked if everything was okay. She said it was, but the way her eyes flickered down in a way told me otherwise. I didn't push. I just leaned against the porch railing, let the silence stretch, let her fill it if she wanted to. Eventually she did. She said June had brought up some things the night before after I left. Questions, concerns, warnings maybe. She didn't go into detail, but I didn't need her to. I knew the type. The kind of family who had seen enough heartbreak to recognize the warning signs of it, even in people who meant well. June wasn't wrong to be cautious. I wasn't offended. But I could tell it had stirred something in Marlene, something old, something dormant, something rooted in the fear of what letting someone in could cost. She said she needed a little time. It's not distance, not a break, just space to breathe. To think, to make sure this wasn't some late-in-life fantasy filling a void she didn't know she still had. I nodded, not because it didn't sting, but because I understood. I had felt it too, that little voice in the back of the mind whispering that something this good, this unexpected, couldn't possibly last. I told her I'd give her what she needed, no pressure, no expectations, just time. Over the next few days I kept myself busy, took a few small jobs around town, fixed a gate for an elderly couple, painted a fence for a single mom who reminded me of someone I couldn't quite place. I didn't reach out to Marlene, and she didn't text either. But she stayed in my mind like a song I couldn't shake. her face, her voice, the way her hand felt in mine. Those things didn't fade. They settled in deeper. That was the thing about connection. It didn't disappear when you walked away from it. It followed you, quietly, patiently, reminding you what it felt like to be seen then. One evening, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the trees and cast long shadows across my porch, I saw headlights sweep across the road in front of my house. A few seconds later, there was a soft knock at my door. I knew it was her before I even opened it. Marlene stood there in a long coat, her expression unreadable, her hands tucked into her pockets. I stepped aside, and she walked in without a word. She didn't sit. She just stood near the center of the room, looking around like she was seeing it for the first time, and she turned to me and said she had spoken with June again. That June had reminded her that love wasn't something you measured by risk alone. That you couldn't guard your way into happiness. That letting someone in would always carry the possibility of hurt, but it also carried the possibility of something extraordinary. And then finally she looked me in the eye and said that she missed me. That the silence between us had felt heavier than any of her fears. That when I didn't text, she realized how used to me she had become. Out of neediness, but out of comfort. Out of joy. Out of feeling whole for the first time in years. I didn't say anything. I just walked to her and placed my hands on her shoulders, steady and calm. She leaned into me slowly, and I wrapped my arms around her like it was the most natural thing in the world, and maybe it was. Maybe it always had been. We stayed that way for a long time. No words, no explanations. Just two people standing in the quiet knowing of something real. Later that night, after she had gone home, I sat on the edge of my bed and thought about all the years I'd spent drifting. Thought of all the places I'd passed through, all the moments I'd convinced myself that connection wasn't for me. And then I thought of her, of Marlene. With her gravel paths and her lavender-scented shed, her cautious smile, and the way she said my name like it meant something, and I realized I wasn't drifting anymore. I was staying. For the first time in my life, I wanted to stay. The days that followed her visit to my house took on a new texture, as though the air between us had thickened with something quieter and deeper than the excitement of first connection. We didn't talk about love. Not directly. We didn't make grand plans or promises, didn't draw lines around what we were or label it for clarity. What we did instead was show up. She'd leave the porch light on in the evenings. I'd pass by after dinner with no real reason. Always finding her there with a blanket over her knees and an extra cup of tea in her hands. The simplicity of it all was what made it profound. We had gone from glances and silences to presences and pauses. And somehow that felt more intimate than any candlelit dinner or whispered "I love you." This was something neither of us had expected. Not at our ages, not with our pasts. But we were leaning into it with the quiet faith of people who'd both been through enough to know that rare things often speak the softest. One morning, I found myself at her house before the sun was fully up. I hadn't slept well. Something about the stillness of the night had stirred restlessness in me and knew without thinking. I made coffee, got in the truck, and drove to the place that had started to feel like a second home. Her driveway was still, damp from the rain the night before, and the gravel glistened as though it, too, was waking up slowly. I sat in my truck for a few minutes before getting out, not wanting to startle her, not even sure if she was awake. But the porch light clicked on as I stepped out, and there she was in the doorway. Wrapped in a long cardigan, her hair loose and wild from sleep. A surprised but gentle expression on her face that told me I wasn't intruding. We didn't talk much that morning. We sat on the porch wrapped in our own quiet, sipping coffee and watching the mist pull away from the tops of the trees. The world felt like it belonged to us in those moments. No traffic, no voices, just birds beginning to sing, and the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. There was a sacredness to it, like time had paused just long enough to remind us that presence true, full presence was its own kind of devotion. I glanced at her once and caught her smiling to herself, and I realized how rarely people notice. The quiet joy of simply existing beside someone, no words, no performance, just being allowed to be near someone without having to earn it. That morning, without saying a word, she placed her hand on my knee, and left it there for the better part of an hour. It wasn't romantic in the cinematic sense. It was something better, real, lived in, honest. Later that day, she asked if I would help her clear out the attic. It was one of those spaces she'd been meaning to organize for years, but had never found the motivation to tackle. I agreed, more out of a desire to spend time with her than any real interest in sorting through old boxes. The attic was warm and dust-heavy, with low beams and creaky floorboards, filled with the kind of forgotten things that hold quiet stories no one remembers telling. We spent hours pulling down boxes, opening lids, and rediscovering pieces of her life she hadn't looked at in decades. Old photographs, yellowed letters, clothes from another lifetime. There were moments when she grew quiet, turning an object over in her hands, letting the memory settle before placing it gently in the pile to keep or discard. At one point, she handed me a photo of her from her 20s, standing next to a man I assumed was her ex-husband. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. The look on her face was enough to tell me that whatever once was had long faded, and what remained now was a threadbare shadow of what used to be. I didn't ask questions. I just kept working, letting her share what she chose, letting her silence speak when it wanted to. In that space of dust and memories, something unspoken passed between us, a kind of trust. The kind that grows when someone lets you see not just who they are now, but who they once were and who they tried to be. After hours of lifting and sorting, we sat on the floor near the attic window, surrounded by half-open boxes and old linens. The sun had shifted across the sky, casting a slanted beam through the dusty glass and warming the wooden floor beneath us. She leaned her head on my shoulder and exhaled in a way that made me feel like she'd been holding that breath for years. I didn't move. I let her rest there, let her body settle against mine, and in that stillness, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to say out loud yet. I was falling in love with her, not in a sudden, consuming way, but in the slow, unfolding way. That love arrives when you're older, carefully, respectfully, like it's asking permission before making a home in your life. That night, back at my place, I found myself unable to focus. The images from the attic kept coming back to me, the photographs. The boxes labeled in her neat handwriting, the scarf she had found and wrapped around her shoulders as though it still carried warmth from another time. I realized how much of herself she had shared that day, how many doors she had unlocked and let me walk through without ever forcing me to knock. It was humbling, really. She wasn't just letting me into her present, she was letting me into her past, into the room she had closed off and dusted over long ago. That kind of vulnerability didn't come easily. It wasn't performative. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about trust. I wrote her a note that night, just a simple one, folded it into an envelope, and dropped it into her mailbox on my way to the morning job the next day. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. She would know. It said, "You've let me into rooms I didn't know I was worthy of seeing. Thank you for the quiet spaces. They've taught me more about love than words ever could." The morning after I left that letter in her mailbox, I found myself checking my phone more than usual, not out of impatience, but out of quiet anticipation. I didn't expect a dramatic reaction. Marlene wasn't the type to flood your phone with emojis or send paragraphs laced with declarations. She processed things inwardly, turning them over in her mind like river stones until the roughness wore down and the truth shone through. I admired that about her. Still, by midday, when I hadn't heard anything, not a call, I felt a flutter of uncertainty, not panic, not doubt. Just the soft echo of vulnerability that comes when you hand someone a piece of your heart, even gently, and wait to see if they hold it or let it fall. I busied myself with work to keep the thoughts at bay. I had a small job patching up a stone wall for a retired teacher who lived on the edge of town. She was chatty, the kind who offered lemonade and unsolicited advice about life and relationships while I worked. Normally, I would have nodded along and let her words pass over me. But something about her reminded me of Marlene, maybe. The way she folded her arms when she asked a question, or the way she smiled with her eyes more than her mouth. She told me love at her age was different, that it didn't come crashing through the door like it did when you were 20. Instead, it knocked gently, waited patiently, and often slipped in while you were making tea or folding laundry. Wasn't always loud, she said, but it was always honest. I thanked her as I loaded my tools and drove off, her words lingering like the scent of lavender in an old sweater. By the time I got home, the sun was already dipping low, the sky painted in strokes of amber and rose. I was about to head inside when I noticed something at the base of my Doran envelope, pale blue and tucked just enough under the mat to avoid the breeze. My heart stuttered. I bent down, picked it up, and turned it over. No name, no writing. Just weight. Just presence. I took it inside, sat on the edge of the couch, and opened it slowly, careful not to tear anything more than necessary. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, and in Marlene's steady handwriting, just a few lines. She had read my note. She said it stopped her, mid-sip of coffee, her porch still wrapped in morning fog. She said she reread it twice before setting it on the table, staring at it like it had arrived from a life she never dared to imagine. Then, in the quiet that followed, she realized she had already let me into more than just her home. Let me into the rhythm of her days, into her thoughts as she walked the garden paths, into the way she planned her afternoons around whether or not she might see me. She told me she was afraid not of me, but of what this meant, of how easy it had become to picture me still beside her a year from now, or 5 or more. And she ended the note with one line, "Come by tonight. I have something to show you." Didn't rush. I changed clothes, washed the dirt and stone dust off my hands, brushed my hair back, and drove with the windows down, letting the warm breeze settle me. When I pulled into her driveway, she was waiting on the porch. No fanfare, no nervous pacing, just standing there in a soft sweater and jeans, holding 2 glasses of wine and wearing a look that told me she'd spent the day gathering courage. In quiet pieces, she handed me a glass and led me around the side of the house. The garden was bathed in twilight, the last golden rays catching the tops of the flowers. I noticed something different. New wooden posts along the path. Simple, but carefully placed, each with a small lantern hanging from a metal hook. They weren't on yet, but I could see tiny solar panels nestled on top. We walked in silence until we reached the far end of the garden, near the old tree where the breeze always felt cooler. There she had placed a bench, new, untouched, made of weathered gray wood, smooth and inviting. She motioned for me to sit, and when we did, the first of the lanterns flickered on behind us, then another and another. One by one, the path lit up in soft golden glows, tracing the way we had walked, illuminating the gravel with warmth. She told me she had been working on it slowly, quietly for weeks. The lanterns, the posts, the bench, not because she knew I'd be here, but because part of her hoped, and hope, she said, needed a place to land. We sat there for a long time, sipping wine, watching the lights settle into their evening hum. She didn't speak much, and neither did I, but when she finally turned to me and rested her head on my shoulder, I felt the unspoken shift. This wasn't hesitation anymore. This wasn't waiting to see. This was her choosing, in her own way, to move forward with me. That night, I didn't stay over. I didn't need to. What mattered had already been said, already been shared. As I drove home beneath a sky dusted with stars, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. Not the peace that comes from finishing a job or closing a chapter, but the peace that rises when you know you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what your heart has been quietly waiting for. The following days carried with them a calmness that felt earned, as though we had crossed through some quiet threshold and left the world behind us unchanged, but with a subtle difference in the way it looked from our side of the door. The bench Marlene had built at the edge of the garden became something of a ritual. Every evening, just as the lanterns began to flicker on one by one and the breeze moved low and slow through the leaves, I'd find myself back there with her, letting the hush of early nightfall wrap around us like an old sweater. There were still no dramatic declarations between us, no impulsive I love yous tossed into the wind, and I think we both preferred it that way. What we were building didn't ask for noise. It asked for consistency, for presence, for choosing to show up even when nothing was required of us but stillness. It was during one of those evenings, When the sky was turning from soft peach to muted gray, that I felt something stir in me, not panic, not doubt, but an old habit that had been resting dormant. For so long, I'd been wired to move on. When things got too comfortable, too quiet, I'd always found a way to pack up, tell myself there was more to see, that staying meant settling, and settling meant getting stuck. But that night, sitting on the bench beside her, watching the light stretch down the garden path and the shadows of trees bend softly across the gravel, I realized that what I used to call getting stuck had always been just fear of being known, of being held accountable to something real, something that asked me not to perform, but to participate. And here, with Marlene, there was no room for performance. She didn't need someone to dazzle her, needed someone who would keep coming back, who would sit with her through the uneventful days and still find something worth staying for. Next morning, I found myself walking the town's antique market alone, not looking for anything in particular, but letting the rhythm of the place guide me. There was something comforting about the rows of mismatched furniture, the smell of old paperbacks and polished brass, the quiet murmurs of couples debating over teacups and broken clocks. I ran my fingers across the worn spines of books and the curved edges of ceramic bowls, letting my thoughts drift toward her. I had started thinking in terms of her. That realization surprised me, not in the way that made me question it, but in the way that made me feel like my life had grown a new limb I hadn't realized I needed until it moved. Toward the back of the market. Tucked beneath a striped canvas awning, I found a man selling hand-carved wooden pieces bowls, candle holders, jewelry boxes, the kind of crafts that carried with them the fingerprints of care. I asked him if he took commissions, and when he said yes, I described the lantern posts Marlene had built. I wanted something small, I told him. Single piece that matched the shape of her work, simple, smooth, humble, keepsake, maybe a wooden box, with her initials carved beneath the lid. Something that could hold matches for the lanterns or just sit on the bench between us like a silent testament to what we'd started. He nodded slowly, told me to come back in a week, and without hesitation, I handed him the cash. Away, I realized I hadn't done something like that in years. Buying something for someone not out of obligation, not because it was a holiday or a birthday, but because I saw her in it, because it felt like a way to say, I see you. I value you. I'm thinking about tomorrow with you in it. For someone who had spent the better part of his adult life living out of duffel bags and avoiding even the mention of long-term, it felt like building a cathedral. When I got to her house later that evening, she was already outside digging around. The base of one of the flower beds near the garden path. Her hands were dirty, her hair pinned up in that loose, familiar way, and she looked up with a grin that made something settle deep in my chest. I didn't tell her about the box, not yet. I wanted it to be a surprise, something small that arrived without a reason, like our first conversations, or the way our routines had quietly merged. Instead, I dropped to my knees beside her, dug my fingers into the soil, and helped her without needing to be asked. That night, as we sat on the bench again, something changed, not in her words or her tone, but in the way she leaned against me, in the way her hand rested on my thigh with more certainty than before. She told me she had been dreaming again, not of anything specific, but just dreaming. For years, her sleep had been silent, heavy with the kind of exhaustion that came from living alone, from keeping up a life that required constant self-reliance. But now, she said, she was waking up remembering things, gardens that didn't exist, songs she hadn't heard in decades, houses with rooms that seemed familiar even though she had never stepped foot in them. She said it like a confession, like she wasn't sure if it meant anything, but to me it did. It meant her mind was softening, that her inner world was shifting, that I had entered more than just her daily schedule. I had entered the architecture of her rest. We didn't stay long that night. A chill had settled into the air, and the garden was quiet in that way it gets. Just before a storm, even when the sky is clear. As I walked her to the door, she paused beneath the porch light, turned toward me, and for a moment just looked. No smile, no words. Just eyes that held me like they were remembering something important. Then she leaned forward, pressed her forehead to mine, and whispered a thank you, so quiet it almost disappeared into the night. I stood there for a while after she went inside, listening to the sounds of her house creaking floors, the low hum of something mechanical, the faint click of a light being turned off upstairs. I wanted to remember it all. The ordinary, the stillness, the scent of the night air, and the distant chirp of insects. I was no longer counting the hours until I left. I was counting the days I got to stay. And for someone like me, that shift wasn't just was seismic. It meant that everything I thought I knew about what I wanted had changed without permission. And for once, I didn't want it back the way it was. The morning came with a gentle, overcast sky. The kind of gray that didn't threaten rain but blanketed the world in soft, filtered light. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee in hand, the steam curling toward my face, and just stood on my porch for a while. The quiet stretched far that morning, broken only by the low hum of waking cicadas and the rustle of leaves shifting under. A breeze that carried a scent of pine and something faintly floral. Maybe blooming honeysuckle from the edge of a neighbor's fence. I thought of Marlene immediately, not in a frantic way like I needed to reach her, but in the steady hum that she had become a natural rhythm in my mind, a presence always tethered to my thoughts, no matter the time of day. Even doing the most mundane tasks, shaving, folding laundry, fixing the hinges on the rickety screen, I found myself picturing her. Not just what she looked like, but the way she moved, the quiet grace in her gestures, the way she exhaled. Just before speaking, how her voice lowered when she was unsure of something. It was no longer infatuation. It had settled into something more durable. The novelty had worn off, and what remained was comfort, respect, a growing tenderness that didn't need grand gestures to feel real. I had plans to finish a minor landscaping job that afternoon, but as the hours inched forward, I found myself pulling into her driveway instead. I didn't call first. We were past that now. Her driveway, once a line between client and contractor, now felt like an open Gaetan unspoken invitation for closeness. When I knocked, there was no answer at first, and for a brief second I considered turning back. But then I heard footsteps, slow and careful, and when she opened the door, her expression was unreadable, soft but tired, like she had something sitting on her chest that sleep hadn't been able to lift. I asked if she was all right, and she nodded, stepping aside to let me in. The house was warm, filled with the faint scent of fresh bread and vanilla, and I noticed a half-filled mug of tea on the counter. She'd been up for a while. We settled in the kitchen. It's the silence between us, not strained, but heavy with something unspoken. She fiddled with the dish towel as she stood by the window, looking out into the yard like she was waiting for something to appear. I leaned against the counter, watching her, giving her the space to speak first. After a while, she turned and said she'd had a strange morning. Nothing dramatic, no emergencies, just ... motion. She'd woken up from a dream that lingered. In that odd space between real and imagined, one of those dreams that doesn't fade as the day goes on but clings to the edges of your mood, reshaping how everything looks. In the dream, she said, she was walking through a house she didn't recognize, filled with rooms that belonged to people she didn't know. And every time she opened a door, she found a version of herself at a different age: 25, 37, 49. In each room, she was alone, not sad, but still. Waiting when she woke up, she said it wasn't fear she felt, it was grief. Grief not for what she had lost, but for all the versions of herself that had waited so long for someone to arrive. She didn't cry when she told me this. She wasn't dramatic or poetic about it. She spoke plainly, like someone describing the weather, but it moved through me like a quiet tremor. I understood it in a way I hadn't expected. I, too, had waited. For years. For decades, maybe. Not always consciously, but in subtle ways, turning away from anything that felt too permanent, pulling back from anything that hinted at responsibility or belonging. I realized then that maybe all those years of wandering hadn't been aimless. After all, maybe I'd been circling around the idea of home, too afraid to land, too afraid that if I did, it wouldn't last. And yet here she was, standing in her kitchen with soft hands and vulnerable eyes, telling me that she had been waiting too. I didn't say much in response. I just moved toward her, took the dish towel gently from her hands, and folded it neatly. on the counter before wrapping my arms around her waist. She leaned into me, her head resting against my shoulder, and for a while, we just stood like that. The refrigerator hummed quietly, and a bird called out from somewhere in the yard, but inside the house, the world stilled. That moment was more intimate than anything physical. It was raw and honest, a moment of being seen without needing to explain anything. She whispered something then so faint I almost didn't catch it, that this, whatever it was between us, was changing her, not making her someone else, but making her more herself than she had been in years. Later that day, we walked through the garden again, past the now familiar lanterns and the quiet stone paths. She showed me a spot near the back fence where she wanted to plant something new. She wasn't sure what yet, maybe hydrangeas or peonies, but she wanted it to be something permanent, something that would bloom year after year. She laughed a little when she said it, admitting how silly it sounded, but I didn't think it was silly at all. It made perfect sense. Planting something, watching it grow, returning to it again and again, that was hope in action. Faith, we spent the rest of the afternoon digging in the dirt, our hands side by side, silent except for the occasional shared smile or passing comment about soil quality or spacing. It felt like an ordinary day, but beneath it was the pulsing recognition that something extraordinary was unfolding, not in any one gesture or word, but in the slow accumulation of trust and shared presence. That night, as I left her driveway and the sun dipped below the horizon, I thought about how love, real love, was less like a lightning strike and more like a garden. Quiet, intentional, requiring patience and care. I realized I was ready to keep planting. The week that followed moved at a steady, comforting pace, like the quiet ticking of a familiar old clock. Mornings blurred into afternoons, and evenings softened into nights filled with stillness and small rituals. Each day, I found myself returning to Marlin's place not out of obligation or habit, but because it had begun to feel like an extension of my own life. Her porch light, always flicked on by the time the sun dipped low, felt like a silent welcome, a lighthouse guiding me home. We didn't need to speak much about what we were doing, what we were becoming. It was understood in the way we moved around each other, in the easy way our hands found the same tools in her garden shed, or the way our footsteps synced as we walked the lantern-lit paths. It wasn't dramatic. It was ordinary in the most sacred way, and I found myself grateful for that. That Friday afternoon, as the sky shifted between pale blue and muted gold, I wrapped up a quick maintenance job across town and felt a pull too. Stopped by the antique woodworker's stall again. He'd sent me a message a few days earlier to say the box was ready. When I arrived, he greeted me with a nod and handed me a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of twine. I waited until I got back to my truck to unwrap it. The box was beautiful in its simplicity, smooth, dark walnut, with a subtle grain, rounded corners, and a quiet weight that felt right in my hands. When I opened the lid, the hinges made no sound, and inside sat a single slip of linen with her initials burned into the corner. He had done exactly what I asked for. Understated, intentional, honest. Just like her. I took the long way to her house that evening, driving through the outskirts where the trees arched over the road like old friends leaning in close. I thought about how different things felt now compared to just weeks ago. Back then I was still moving through life with one foot always near the door. I hadn't realized how much of my world had been shaped by the instinct to retreat, to prepare for loss before anything had the chance to settle. But with her, something had shifted. Wasn't that I had stopped preparing for disappointment, I just didn't feel the need to anymore. With Marlene, the ground didn't feel like it would give out. It felt solid, even in its imperfections. When I arrived, she was out in the garden, kneeling near the fence, her hands deep in the dirt, pulling weeds with the quiet focus of someone who had learned how to make peace with the slow, repetitive parts of life. I watched her for a moment before stepping out of the truck, holding the wrapped box behind my back like some schoolboy with a secret. She didn't notice me right away, and I let myself enjoy the image of her, their hair pulled back, skin-kissed. By the golden light, completely unaware of how beautiful she looked just existing. When she finally turned and saw me, she smiled in that slow way of hers, the corners of her mouth curling like she was letting the feeling bloom rather than forcing it. I handed her the box without ceremony. No speech, no build-up, just placed it in her soiled, dusted hands and nodded for her to open it. She did, carefully peeling back the paper and lifting the lid like she was afraid of breaking something delicate. When she saw what was inside, she didn't speak right away. Her fingers hovered over the carved initials, and I saw the shift in her eyes before she said anything. Surprise, gratitude, something softer underneath. She asked what it was for, and I told her it was just because she made things by hand and left parts of herself in the details. Because she built lantern posts and benches and still had space to dream of planting peonies. Because she made ordinary things sacred. She didn't respond with words. Instead, she reached out and wrapped her arms around me, pressing her face against my chest, and we stood there. The garden around us alive with birdsong and the rustle of a passing breeze. That night, I sat on the bench again, the new box resting. Between us, already at home among the lanterns and the growing vines, she lit a candle and placed it inside, letting the soft glow spill through the slightly open lid, and said it felt like a promise. Not a grand one, not a forever kind of thing, but a small daily kind of promise, the kind that gets renewed in the quiet decisions to stay, to show up, to listen. I told her I'd never made that kind of promise before. Not really. She told me she'd never received one like that either. We let the silence sit after that, let the meaning settle without trying to shape it into anything too polished. The stars began to appear one by one, and we lay back on the bench, our shoulders pressed together, her fingers laced loosely with mine. The night was cool, but not cold, and there was something about the air that felt cleansing. Like everything unnecessary had been stripped away, and what remained was just two people learning how to be good to each other. I thought then about how many times I'd walked away from things before they could grow, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to hold something without preparing for the moment I'd have to let it go. With her, I didn't feel that pressure. I didn't feel like I had to anticipate the ending. All I wanted was the next day, the next bench, the next box, the next moment that made this ordinary love feel extraordinary. And as the night wore on, as the candle in the little box flickered lower and the garden grew darker, I realized I wasn't just building a life that included her. I was beginning to build one around her. And for the first time in years, that didn't scare me. It gave me peace. It made me feel found. Sunday morning unfolded slowly, that unhurried rhythm that only comes when you finally allowed yourself to let go of urgency. The sky was overcast again, though no rain came. It was the kind of day that made you move slower, linger longer, and look for warmth in familiar places. I didn't have any jobs lined up for the day, which was unusual for me. But I'd found myself leaving little pockets of space in my schedule more often lately. Openings I once would have filled immediately, now left untouched in case she wanted. To take a walk, plant something new, or just sit on the bench and sip coffee. It wasn't dependency. It was consideration, an instinct that had quietly reshaped itself inside me. Aligning my steps with hers even when we were apart, I made a quick breakfast: eggs, toast, nothing fancy, and thought about the candle box again, still glowing softly. In my mind, like it had under the stars that night. That moment hadn't left me. If anything, it had deepened, settled into the foundation of how I saw her, how I saw us. There was something about giving her something handmade, something useful and quiet, that had shifted the energy between us. I hadn't done it to impress her. I'd done it because I was beginning to understand that love didn't always need to announce itself. Sometimes it simply needed to show up, to be present, to be useful and kind and thoughtful without waiting for applause. By mid-morning, I found myself back in her driveway, and even though I hadn't called ahead, I didn't feel like I needed to. Her house had become something like a second heartbeat in my life, steady, grounding, and welcoming. When I walked up to the porch, I noticed something taped to the door. A simple note in her handwriting, around back. "Come slow." I smiled, tucked the note into my pocket, and stepped quietly around the side yard. Following the curve of the house and the familiar scent of soil and rosemary, she was there near the back fence. Crouched in the garden, her hair pulled up beneath a soft, wide-brimmed hat I hadn't seen before. There was dirt on her jeans, a smudge on her cheek, and a look of calm concentration on her face as she gently pressed a sapling into the earth. She didn't look up right away, and I didn't speak. I just watched her for a while, taking in the way her hands moved with such care, the way she leaned in like the small tree mattered more than the passing of time. Eventually, she glanced over her shoulder and smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners in that familiar, grounding way. She stood, wiped her hands on her pants, and motioned for me to come closer. She'd been planting trees, 3 of them, spaced evenly near the edge of the yard, where the lantern stopped and the wild grass began. About legacy lately, about what we leave behind that grows without us. The trees were her quiet answer, not a garden bed you had to tend to constantly. Not flowers that bloomed and faded within a season. Trees, tall, strong, slow. The kind of thing that starts small and becomes something that outlives us. She didn't say all that, of course, but I could see it in the way she touched the base of the trunk, her fingers tracing the bark like it was something holy. I helped. Her watered them, anchoring each with a wooden stake she had already prepared, and we worked in silence, side by side, like we had so many times before. The sound of the watering can, the gentle creak of the wheelbarrow, the distant call of birds overhead, all became part of our quiet rhythm. And somewhere between the second and third tree, I realized that I wasn't waiting for the next step anymore. No. I wasn't wondering what this would turn into or how long it would last. I was in it fully and without hesitation. This wasn't something to figure out anymore. It was something to live in day by day, act by act, gesture by gesture. Later, we sat on the porch, each with a glass of lemonade in hand, watching the breeze move through the garden. The candle box sat on the table between us, the lid cracked open just enough to catch the sunlight. She reached into it, pulled out a match, and struck it gently against the edge, lighting the candle again, even though it was broad daylight. She said she liked the smell. It made the porch feel more like a memory in the making. I didn't say anything at first, just nodded and leaned back in my chair, letting the smoke curl up between us like a conversation. I didn't need to finish. There was a kind of peace in that moment that I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not the fleeting peace of a vacation or a quiet morning after a long week, but the deep, settled kind that comes from knowing you're in the right place, the right person, at the right time. I could feel it in my chest, in the slow rhythm of my breath, in the way the corners of her eyes softened every time she glanced at me. This was no longer just a story unfolding. It was a life taking root. As the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the porch, she stood up slowly and stretched, her back arching like a cat, her limbs moving with the kind of tiredness that only comes from doing something real. She looked down at me, her silhouette outlined by the fading light, and said she was going to make dinner, nothing fancy. Just roasted vegetables and grilled chicken butt, that I was welcome to stay. And I said yes before she even finished the sentence, because of course I would. Where else would I want to be? That evening, we ate on the back deck under a canopy of string lights she had installed years ago, but rarely used. The trees we had planted stood like quiet sentinels at the edge of the yard, barely taller than we were now, but with the promise of someday reaching beyond the roofline. She talked about her favorite books, the ones she returned to when she needed grounding. And I told her stories from jobs I'd done over the years, people I'd met, things I'd built and left behind. But this felt like something I was finally building to keep. And as the stars began to appear, one by one, I looked at her and realized I was no longer afraid. Not of staying. Not of loving. Not of being seen. Because she saw me already fully, quietly, honestly, and she had chosen to stay. And for the first time in a long time, I knew I would choose the same. Every single day, the next few days passed like a quiet melody, the kind that loops in the background of a moment you don't want to end. Life didn't slow down so much as it found a new rhythm, hers and mine, side by side, not always in perfect step, but close enough that it felt like harmony. Marlene had started leaving the back gate open in the mornings. a small gesture that said more than any invitation ever. Could I come by with coffee sometimes, other times with tools in hand, ready to fix whatever needed attention? But more often than not, I found myself sitting beside her while she worked through her morning routine, watering the plants, brushing the dog, checking the bird feeders, watching her move through these simple acts with the same grace and thoughtfulness she gave to everything else in her life. There was a moment, midweek, when I realized how embedded she had become in my thinking. I'd stopped at a hardware store to pick up a new trowel and some paint for a side job I had agreed to finish by the weekend. While walking through the aisles, I found myself reaching for a spool of twine not because I needed it, but because I remembered her mentioning that hers kept unraveling. That kind of unconscious thought, the instinct to consider someone else's needs without fanfare, was still new to me. And yet it was becoming second nature, as natural as grabbing an extra bottle of water before a long job or tightening a screw I noticed was loose, even if no one asked. I wasn't just in her life anymore. I was tending to it, the way she had been tending to mine without even trying. That afternoon, I came back to her place and found her out near the driveway, measuring the edges of the path with a look of quiet focus. She told me she was thinking about lining it with stones, something subtle but sturdy, a way to give shape to the space without making it too formal. I offered to help, and for the next few hours we moved in sync, our bodies falling into an easy rhythm, measuring, digging, placing the stones one by one. There was something deeply satisfying in the repetition, the shared goal. The way our silence didn't feel empty, but full of unspoken understanding. Occasionally she'd pause to wipe her forehead or stand back and squint at the work like an artist assessing her canvas, and I'd find myself watching her instead of the driveway. I kept thinking how beautiful she looked when she was focused, not in some polished magazine cover way, but in that deeply human way that only shows itself when someone is doing something they care about. That evening, after the stones had been placed and the tools put away, we sat again on the garden bench, our shoes still dusty and our hands nicked from the work. She poured us each a glass of cold tea, and we leaned back, watching the sun slip lower behind the trees. That's when she told me about a call she'd received from her sister in another state. Nothing urgent, she said, just a long overdue check-in, but it brought something up in her. They had talked about their parents, about the house they grew up in, about how differently each of them had carried the weight of their upbringing. Her sister had asked if she ever thought about leaving, about starting fresh somewhere new. And Marlene, after a long pause, had said no, not anymore, not since recently. She looked at me when she said that, and I didn't press. I knew what she meant. Sometimes people leave because they're searching for peace, for clarity, for something they can't name. But other times, staying becomes the act of courage. Choosing to be still, to root down, to give the life you already have. A second chance it takes more bravery than any road trip or cross-country move ever could. And I saw in her face that she had made her choice, not because of fear, but because she had finally found something that felt worth staying for. Later that night, back in my own place, I stood at the window, looking out at the quiet street. Had been months since I first pulled into her driveway, thinking it was just another job, just another fence or shed or broken appliance. But that job had turned into something else entirely. It had turned into dinners and candlelight, into garden beds and planted trees, into a wooden box that now sat beside her with a candle burning even in the daytime. It had turned into a relationship built not on sweeping gestures but on steady presence, standing there, watching the moonlight filter through the branches outside my window. I realized that, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was no longer drifting. I had found an anchor the next morning. I got up before the sun, not because I had work lined up, because I had something else in mind. I drove to the edge of town where the nursery was just opening, and I wandered through the rows of plants, until I found what I was looking for, young cherry blossom tree. It was still small, but strong, its branches already thick with promise. I thought about how she had talked about legacy, about planting something that would outlive us, and I knew this was the right choice. I bought it, loaded it carefully into the back of my truck, and headed to her place. When I arrived, she was surprised, of course surprised, but not startled. She greeted me with that same look I had come to know so well, soft, curious, touched with the faintest smile. I didn't say much. I just pointed to the tree, then to the spot near the back fence, just beside the ones she had planted earlier. She understood immediately. Together, we dug the hole, settled the roots, and packed the earth around them. And when it was done, we stood in silence, looking at it, not just the tree, but everything it meant. It was a future, a marker, a quiet shared promise that we were building something worth returning to. And for both of us, that was everything. The cherry blossom sapling stood like a quiet sentinel in the corner of her yard, its delicate branches swaying gently with the wind, leaves whispering secrets only the seasons could understand. There was something poetic about its presence, something that suggested time and patience and reward for the faithful. Every time I looked at it, I didn't just see a tree. I saw her. I saw us. Saw the possibility of what we were becoming. Not something forged in haste, but something earned through care and choice. And day by day, that truth began to root itself more deeply into my life than I expected. The transformation wasn't loud. It was slow and almost imperceptible. But it was happening. The next morning was unusually chilly for that time of year. It's a kind of cold that snuck into your bones and made you appreciate warm mugs and thick socks. I woke up with the thought of her already sitting softly in the back of my mind, as natural now as breathing. It was the way she was becoming part of my habits. I'd make 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, even if I was alone. Or catch myself humming songs she had introduced me to while fixing up a window frame or organizing the back of my truck. The repetition of it all wasn't burdensome, it was comforting. It was the rhythm of someone settling into a life that wasn't just theirs anymore. Her name began to live in the space between my thoughts, and her laugh sometimes echoed in the back of my memory like a favorite old movie. You rewatch just to feel something familiar, but life, as it often does, has a way of testing the structures. We build when we least expect it. That afternoon, just after I'd returned from picking up new paving stones for a client, I got a call. It was from my brother, someone I hadn't spoken to much in the past couple of years, not because of any animosity, but because our lives had simply taken different paths. He was calling from out of state, his voice hurried and low, the kind of tone that immediately told me something was wrong. He told me our father had collapsed and had been taken to the hospital. It was serious, a heart issue. Unpredictable, sudden, and possibly life-altering. The doctors didn't know how it would go. He asked if I could come, if I could be there to help make decisions, to carry some of the weight of it all. I said I'd be there as soon as I could. Hanging up the phone, I stared at the floor for a long moment, not quite processing everything. My father and I had always had a strained relationship, built more on silence than connection. He was a good man, but a distant one, someone who taught through action rather than affection. We never spoke much about feelings or life or choices. We were more like 2 people occupying different corners of the same house, bound by blood but not by closeness. Still, he was my father. And part of me had always held out hope that one day we'd have a conversation that really mattered. I knew I had to go. There wasn't even a question about it. But as I started gathering what I needed, duffel bag keys, a few clothes, I felt the weight of leaving her, even if just for a few days, not because I didn't trust what we had, but because I had only just started to feel rooted for the first time in a very long while. Leaving felt like pulling up from soil I had finally started to settle into. And worse, I hadn't even told her yet. She had no idea what was happening. On my end of the phone, while she was probably in her kitchen or brushing soil off her gloves in the garden, I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom, holding my phone, wondering how to explain that I needed to leave just when things had started to feel permanent. Driving to her house felt different this time. There was no hum of casual excitement, no soft expectation of an evening spent on the bench or under the string lights. This time the air was thick with anticipation and worry, and I was rehearsing what I would say even as I pulled into her driveway. Could knock, a soft smile on her face that faded slightly the moment she saw mine. I didn't even have to explain everything. She looked at my bag, looked at me, and something in her expression shifted, not fear, not confusion, but something like concern laced with understanding. We sat down in her living room, and I told her everything. The call, my father, the urgency, my need to go. She listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap, nodding slowly, the way someone does when they're absorbing more than just words. When I finished, she didn't respond with panic or frustration. She just reached out and placed her hand over mine, her thumb moving in small, grounding circles. She said she understood. That family, no matter how complicated, is still family. That there are moments in life where everything else has to pause, and that she would be here when I got back, if I wanted her to be. The relief that washed over me at those words was deeper than I expected. I hadn't realized how much I had, feared disrupting what we had. But her response was more than I could have hoped for. It was grace, plain and simple. We walked out to the garden before I left. The cherry blossom tree caught the light of the late afternoon sun, and for a moment, everything felt still. I looked at it and then at her, and I felt something in my chest tighten and release at the same time. I told her I'd call when I arrived, but I didn't know how long I'd be gone. She nodded, and then she said something I hadn't expected. She said, "This tree will be here when you get back." "I'll be here too," I believed her. As I pulled out of the driveway and drove toward a past I thought I had left behind, carried her words with me. They were a compass now, pointing me not just toward where I had come from, but where I wanted to return to. The road out of town stretched long and quiet, framed by overgrown grass and distant trees that blurred at the edges as I sped past. The hum of the engine became a kind of comfort, a low, constant reminder that I was heading into something I couldn't prepare for. I kept the windows cracked open even though the air was sharp with early evening chill, needing to feel something. Real against my skin, something grounded. My bag sat on the passenger seat, zipped halfway, one of Marlene's old flannels stuffed near the top. I hadn't meant to pack it, but it had somehow ended up in the mix, and I didn't bother taking it out. It smelled faintly of cedar and lavender, and as ridiculous as it felt, I kept my hand resting on it from time to time, like it was an anchor to where I had just come from. The hospital was 5 hours away in a town I hadn't visited in years, not since my mother's funeral. My father had stayed there after she passed, never remarrying, never leaving the old house. Just living out his routines in a world that had once made sense and now barely did. The closer I got, the more the past began to press in on me. Memories I hadn't summoned in years began playing like old film reels, my father working silently in the garage, the way his boots scuffed against the concrete, the sound of his breath when he slept, sitting up in his chair after a long day. He wasn't a cruel man, just distant, wrapped in a kind of quiet pride that made closeness difficult. Growing up, I had learned to interpret silence as stability and effort as affection. But even so, a part of me had always wondered what it would have felt like to be held more gently, to be told things instead of expected to guess. I arrived just past midnight. The hospital was bathed in that sterile half-light that makes everything feel suspended between reality and something colder. My brother met me in the parking lot, his face drawn, jaw tight, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered. We hugged briefly, both of us stiff, unfamiliar with the gesture, but understanding its necessity. He filled me in on what the doctors had said: minor heart attack, manageable if caught in time, but more tests needed. Our father was awake, but weak, quieter than usual, and not interested in talking much. That last part didn't surprise me. We went up together. The room was small, filled with the low hum of machines and the scent of antiseptic. He lay there in the bed, thinner than I remembered, eyes closed but not asleep. When he opened them, he looked at us without expression, as if registering to figures from a photo album he hadn't flipped through in a while. My brother spoke first, then sat down at the edge of the bed, while I remained standing near the foot, unsure of what to say. It was strange, standing in front of the man who had taught me how to use a wrench, how to check oil, how to keep a roof from leaking him, yet I had no idea how to speak to him in that moment. The weight of years spent apart, the absence of small talk and emotional language, loomed heavy between us. He nodded once, a small gesture that said more than any sentence he could have offered. That was my father, always communicating in fragments. In movements, in the things he didn't say. I stepped closer, took the chair, and we sat like that for a while. Not as father and son, not as men burdened with history, but as two people trying to make sense of what was left. He drifted in and out of sleep, and during those quieter moments, I found myself watching the monitors, the slow climb and fall of lines, the rhythm of his breath. It reminded me of something Marlene had said weeks ago, that sometimes presence was the most powerful thing you could offer. Just showing up, staying in the room, not turning away. The next day passed slowly. My brother and I took turns talking. To the doctors, handling forms, sorting through medications. We didn't speak much about anything personal, just moved through the logistics like men trained to keep moving forward no matter what. In the quiet moments between tasks, I found myself checking my phone, not for anything urgent, but for her. A message, a note, even just her name on the screen. Around midday, it finally came. A photo-hour cherry blossom sapling, sunlight catching, its leaves just right, with a simple caption, "Still here." It took everything in me not to smile too wide in the hallway. That small connection, that reminder of her steady presence, carried more weight than I expected. She didn't ask for updates. She didn't ask how I was holding up. She just reminded me that what we'd built hadn't disappeared in my absence. Later that evening, after my father had eaten a few bites of food and drifted into a deeper sleep, I stepped outside for air. The hospital garden was small, tucked between two wings of the building, barely more than a bench and a few potted plants. But it was quiet, and I needed that. I sat down, pulled out my phone, and typed a longer message to Marlene. I told her about the drive, about the way the town hadn't changed much, about how strange it was seeing my father like this. I told her I hadn't realized how much I still carried from those years, how the silence between us had shaped me, in ways I was only beginning to understand. And then I told her about the cherry blossom tree, how I kept seeing it in my mind, how I imagined it growing even when I wasn't there to witness it, how I hoped she knew that the same was true of what we had. She responded within minutes. Just a few words. We grow things slow, so they last longer. It was the kind of sentence that stayed with you, that nestled into your chest and kept beating quietly when everything else around you felt noisy. I didn't reply right away. I just held the phone in my hands and stared up at the sky. It was darker here than in our town. Fewer lights, fewer distractions. The stars looked older somehow, like they'd been waiting a long time to be noticed. As I sat there, I thought about what I wanted to say to my father before I left. I didn't know yet if I'd have the courage to say it, but I knew what it would be. That I had found someone who made silence feel safe, that I'd stopped running, that I was learning to stay, to build, to love, without fear. That he had taught me things even when he didn't mean to. That maybe we weren't so different after all, just two men trying to leave something behind that mattered. And when I eventually walked back into that hospital, I didn't feel like I was returning to an old life. I felt like I was carrying a new one with me, one built on soil and stone, and the quiet certainty of a woman who lit candles in daylight and left. Her back gate opened just in case I came home. 3 days passed before I left the hospital town behind. 3 long days marked by the sound of machines beeping steadily, by the quiet steps of nurses and rubber soles, by my father's slow but steady recovery, and by a strange sense of suspension. That made the world outside feel both distant and more meaningful. I hadn't told Marlene exactly when I was coming back, and she hadn't asked. That, more than anything, solidified how different she was from anyone I'd ever known. Fill the silence with worry or demand a timeline. She simply waited, not passively, but with quiet faith. Like someone who trusted that roots didn't disappear just because the leaves were out of sight for a while. On the morning I was set to leave, my father finally spoke in a way that felt like something more than routine acknowledgement. He had just finished half a cup of black coffee, stubbornly refusing the creamer like always, and he looked at me with eyes clearer than they had been in days. He asked me if I was happy, not directly, of course. He phrased it like a man who Wasn't used to asking about feelings. You seem settled. You good out there? But I understood what he meant. I nodded, and for the first time, I didn't hesitate when I said yes. I told him I'd met someone, that she had a garden and a voice like steady rain, that she lit candles in the daytime and liked to plant trees with no expectation of seeing them fully grown. Didn't go into detail, but I said enough for him to hear the shift in my voice. He didn't offer advice or warnings. He just nodded, his mouth twitching at the corners in a way that might have been approval or memory or something in between. That was as much as I would get, and it was enough. The drive back felt different than the drive in. The tension in my shoulders had lessened, replaced by something softer anticipation laced with calm, like knowing exactly what would be on the other side of the door when you walked through it. I passed familiar signs and exits, and with each mile, my mind returned to her laughter across a mug of tea, to the way she tilted her head when listening, to the small lines around her eyes that deepened when she smiled. I pictured the tree we planted, imagined it already taller, even if only by a little. I wondered if she had watered it, or if she'd waited for me to return so we could do it together. I arrived just after dusk. The sky was painted in fading streaks of lavender and rust, the last light stretching long across the street. I pulled into my driveway first, left my bag just inside the door, and then walked to her house. I didn't call. I didn't text. Just followed the rhythm of my feet, the beat that had led me there so many times before. Her gate was open, of course. It creaked slightly as I stepped through, and the soft scent of rosemary and tilled earth greeted me like an old friend. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow across the steps, and I could hear music faintly drifting from inside something classical. Strings that pulled at the heart like memories. She opened the door before I knocked. I don't know how she knew I was there, but she did. She was barefoot, wearing a loose sweater and jeans streaked with flour like she'd been baking. Her hair was pulled up, and she looked at me with those same eyes that had first stopped me mid-sentence weeks ago. She didn't say anything at first. She just stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding since I'd left, the kind of breath that only comes when you're home again. Inside, the kitchen was warm. Something sweet had just come out of the oven, a pie. I guessed in the candle I'd carved the box for was burning on the table. The sight of it nearly undid me. That flame, small and steady, was still dancing, still holding space for me. We didn't rush into conversation. Instead, she poured me tea, set the pie on the counter to cool, and we sat across from one another like no time had passed. And when we did speak, it wasn't about hospitals or health scares or all the things I thought I needed to unload. It was about her garden, how the cherry blossom had surprised her by catching sunlight just right one afternoon. It was about the neighbor's dog getting loose again, and the strange bird that had visited the feeder. It was about little things, shared gently. The way you speak to someone when you know they'll understand the unspoken parts. As the evening stretched on, we moved to the back deck. The string lights hummed faintly above us, and the garden glowed under their soft wash. The trees we'd planted stood like witnesses to our return. We sat on the bench, shoulders touching, the silence between us rich with meaning. I told her I'd thought of her every day, that even in the quietest corners of the hospital, where the lights never dimmed and sleep was more a suggestion than a reality, I had carried her with me. That the image of her lighting that candle, our candle, was something I clung to. She didn't respond with words. She didn't have to. She reached for my hand, intertwined our fingers, and leaned her head gently against my shoulder. In that moment, I realized something simple and profound. I hadn't just returned to the woman I'd left days ago. I had returned to the life we were building. A life marked not by dramatic declarations, but by consistency, by care, by showing up. And even though I had stepped away for a while, she hadn't let anything falter. She had kept the fire burning. She had tended to the garden. She had made room for me, not just in her house, but in her days, in her quiet rituals, in her hopes as the stars blinked into view and the wind carried the scent of something blooming nearby. I closed my eyes and let myself rest, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. For the first time in what felt like years, I didn't feel like I had to brace for the next thing. I didn't feel like I had to fight to be seen or understood. I was here. She was here. And that was enough. The days that followed didn't rush. They arrived quietly, like morning light filtering through linen curtains, soft and steady and sure. The world around us returned to its rhythms, but something inside of me had undeniably changed. I had left behind a version of myself that only knew how to move forward by never looking back. And now, I found myself slowing down, not out of hesitation, but out of reverence. Reverence for what we had grown, for the ground we'd tended. Together, for the time we'd let shape us not by force, but by patience. Every morning, the cherry blossom tree outside Marlene's kitchen window stood taller. It hadn't yet bloomed, but the branches looked fuller, stronger, more confident. In their reach, it reminded me of us. Rooted now, waiting, trusting. We continued with the simple acts that had become our way of loving each other. Sharing morning coffee on the back porch, where sometimes we spoke and sometimes we didn't. Working on the garden, where the silent language of hands in the soil said more than any long-winded confession ever could. I helped her fix an old bird bath that had cracked in 2 places. She helped me sort the chaos in the back of my truck, laughing when she found 3 pairs of identical pliers I'd insisted were all necessary. We cooked together, she, with her recipes passed down from family. Me with the improvisational style of someone used to living out of toolboxes and brown bags. We met somewhere in the middle, and somehow it worked. One afternoon, weeks after I had returned, I brought over a wide wooden planter box I had built in my workshop. It was smooth, oiled, designed with subtle curves that mimicked the arc of the moon. I didn't say much when I gave it to her, just left it near the garden gate and told her she could fill it with whatever she wanted. A few days later, she planted lavender and sweet alyssum in it, both known for their scent, both known for attracting bees. She told me they reminded her of soft summers, of evenings that lasted longer than they had any right to. I told her they reminded me of her. She didn't respond. She just smiled and ran her fingers through the soil. We never declared anything in the way that stories or movies say you should. There was no grand moment, no orchestrated question under candlelight, or dramatic music swelling in the background. But the certainty was there, in the way she reached for my hand when we walked through town, in the way I knew exactly how she took her tea, in the toothbrush she quietly placed next to hers in the bathroom, in the extra set of keys she hung beside her own without mentioning it, in the drawer in her kitchen she cleared out for me one morning, acting like it had always been meant for me. And maybe it had. Eventually we sat down one evening, just as the sun was folding itself behind the hills, and we talked about what came next, not out of pressure or urgency, but because we'd earned that conversation. She asked if I saw myself staying, if I'd ever want to leave again. I told her that wherever she was, that's where I stayed. It was that simple. I didn't want to chase anymore. I didn't need the noise of faraway places, or the illusion that something better was always waiting beyond the horizon. But we had here this quiet love, this steady unfolding was rare. And I would have been a fool to trade it for anything else. So I started keeping more of my tools in her garage. I slowly moved things from my house to her, some clothes, my books, a small framed photo of my mother. We didn't make an event of it. We didn't call it moving in. We just started making space for each other in all the places that mattered. Her home, once lined with solitary grace, began to hum with shared life. A jacket of mine over a chair, a scarf of hers draped over the seat in my truck. Our routines, once parallel, began to braid together. There was one morning clear. Warm, the kind of day that makes the world feel generous, when I stepped out to the garden and found her standing beside the cherry blossom tree. It had begun to bloom. Small, fragile flowers, pale pink and white, soft as breath. The tree was speaking for both of us. It had survived the winter, had endured the winds, had trusted the soil. And now, here it was blossoming, not for the world's applause, but for its own becoming. Just like us, we threw a small gathering one evening, nothing extravagant, just a few neighbors. Her sister from out of town, and the woman from the hardware store who had once lent me a wrench. They brought wine, laughter, stories. Someone brought a guitar. Someone danced barefoot on the grass. Marlene wore a soft blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, and at one point, she looked at me with an expression I'd never forget. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. It was quiet. Sure. A look that said this moment, this life was hers. Ours. A look that said, thank you, without speaking. A look that promised everything we had already begun was only the beginning. Later. That night, when the last guest had gone and the string lights cast long shadows on the lawn, I took her hand and we stood beside the blooming tree. We didn't say anything for a long time, just breathed, just listened to the stillness. And then I whispered, I was fixing your driveway. I didn't know I was walking into my future. She leaned into me, warm and familiar, and said, and I didn't know a man covered in dust would make me feel something I'd given up on. That was our love. Not loud, not quick, but rooted, rising, real. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.